Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first A&K Together live event. It's part of A&K Together, a series of stories from A&K experts and staff around the world who hope to inspire you with their unique experiences during this time. My name is Jordan, and I'll be your host. We're excited to have so many of you joining us tonight. Our presenter is history lecturer Dr. T.H. Bachman. TH is a member of A&K's Luxury Expedition Cruise team, as well as the author of 10 books, including 4 on the polar regions. Today, he'll dive into the story behind arguably one of the greatest polar explorers of all time. So TH, I'm going to hand it over to you, and feel free to start talking about Ernest Shackleton, the story behind one of the world's greatest polar explorers.
Okay, well, I was charged to talk a little bit about Shackleton as a leader, and in particular to make a comparison between his most famous effort and one of his lesser famous offers. You know, when I started talking about Shackleton 35 years ago, nobody in the audience had ever heard of him. People didn't even know he was going to live at the end. And but now you have this explosion of Shackleton mania. You've got picture books, you've got biographies. Even I have a small one of those. And there's a Harvard case study for this. And so he's become some issue of the idea of the polar explorer as a great leader, which is an appropriate thing to do. Well, let me set you. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to talk a little bit about the endurance. That's the 1914 to 1919, 1917 lecture of the expedition. So you get the understanding. Most of this will be this really common knowledge to you, but I'm going to review it for the few that don't. And then I'm going to argue and talk about the other one he did, the Nimrod. So that's what's going to happen. In 1911 and 1912, the South Pole was reached first by Roald Amundsen and then by Robert Falcon Scott. And so for explorers, someone like Shackleton, who sees himself as an explorer, it's all the things are gone. He wonders what can I do? And then it hits him. He gets money, and he announces that he is going to do the last great terrestrial expedition to cross the Antarctic continent in a single season. This will be the last one, the greatest one, and that's what he does on the expedition, which we know as the Endurance expedition because of the name of the ship. Okay, and so that's what it's really, of course, it's really the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Well, this is a 2-hour story. I'm going to try to do it in about 7 or 8 minutes. They sail from England in 1914. They sail all the way down to South George Island, which is an island in the Antarctic, which is an amazing place to see and do. Mountainous. I've done cruises where we've seen 300,000, 400,000 penguins on that island. So he goes down there and then he leaves from that and heads down south to the Weddell Sea, which is towards the Antarctic. And the conditions there are so horrific that season. He realizes he cannot safely get his the land party, off the ship and still maintain safety for his other men. And so he abandons the idea of making the crossing and stays with his men. And they go through the season. And then when the spring comes, the ice begins to break up. And this was a very strong ship, but nothing made by human hands going to withstand a piece of ice hitting the size of Cleveland, hitting one the size of Chicago. It's just going to go. And so that's what happened. Their ship was crushed and sank. And then you had the situation, 28 men living on a piece of floating ice, okay? They are in the Antarctic, the worst weather in the world. They have a lot of options. They can drown by falling off in the night or even during the day. They could starve to death. All these things could happen to them. and they got the worst weather in the world, Antarctica. But they have one thing on their side. They were led by Shackleton. And Shackleton kept them alive and secure on the ice. And when he was able, they launched their boats, made a run to Elephant Island. Now, this one is really lost in many people's narrative because of the next thing he does. He does this trip to Elephant Island, puts his men down so they'll be safe for the winter, but he has to rescue them because he knows if every day he looks away from them, one of them could be hurt or killed. So he takes himself and 5 guys, go on a 21-foot boat across the 800 miles of the worst water in the world. He makes it to South Georgia. He then has to climb and cover to get to the other side over the mountains. By the way, Norwegians had been living there for 20 years and they've said it's impassable. From my point of view, when a Floridian tells you the mountain is impassable, that's one thing, but a Norwegian is another thing. So he and his 2 men cross the mountains. They get a ship. They try to rescue the men at the Elephant Island. He tries a second time. He can't get close to him. Third time, and he's just fanatic because he knows every day one of his men could die. And on the 4th try, they're in awful conditions. 9/10 ice. That means 9/10 of that water is covered by ice and fog. And they find it, and they bring them back, and they get them on the ship, and they take them back to Ushuaia. They get off the ship, and he has done it. He is, despite all of these things, he's brought home every man safe and sound and alive. And this is the basis of Shackleton's aura, his greatness, why there's these books on the Shackleton way to managing. Yeah, put these guys on an ice floe and see how they do. Anyhow, so this is everything probably most people know about Shackleton's life. I mean, this is, if you're on a ship, I would give a lecture either 1 hour in length or 2 hour length to cover this, what I just talked to in a few minutes. But what I'd like to talk about for a second is what other things he did that I think rate the same kind of admiration. So I'm going to take you now back in time. I've been talked about 1914 to 17. I'm going to go back now to 1900. Young Ernest Shackleton, an officer on a merchant marine, a casual meeting. As an historian, I'm a little bit loose on loose on the idea of cause and effect. I think there's a lot of accident and improvisation. And this chance conversation leads to him being appointed an officer on Robert Falcon Scott's first expedition from 1901 to 1904. It was a huge national expedition, heavy on science, but they were going to try to do some exploring maybe towards the pole, that sort of thing. And Shackleton was a charming fellow, very easy to get along with, very popular, not only with his fellow officers, but even with the men in the forecastle. And so when Scott, who is by some people's standards the penultimate British hero, and he was going to make an attempt on the pole, and he decides he would take a guy named Wilson, Bill Wilson. He's a remarkable guy, and when you get through the layers of polar history, these other guys are just so incredible, and you get beyond Shackleton and Scott. Anyhow, the 3 of them, 2 of them decided they'll go to try to get to the pole, and they decided who should be the 3rd person. Both literally, I think, said Shackleton. He's strong, he's knowledgeable, he's skillful, he's tough, and he's a raconteur. You got to be in a tent for 2 months with somebody. You want somebody who can talk. So they set off to the South Pole. Well, we have an advantage that they don't have because they were man hauling. That's where you'll have a strap over your shoulders around it, one of them around your waist, you tie it to your sled, and then you go, oh, like this, and you walk towards the pole. Okay. Well, you realize we have an advantage they don't have. We know you can't carry enough of 1902 period food to get to the pole and back, but they didn't do it, so they tried. They marched south. At one point, Wilson took Captain Scott aside and said, Captain, I've just examined all of us and we all have scurvy. Scurvy is always fatal unless you get fresh food. But Scott was a naval officer. He planned his work. He worked his plan. He continued south with this additional piece of information, but he kept going until the day he had planned. If he said, I can't get the pole by this point, I will turn back. So he does. And as they're going now back north back to the ship, all three men have scurvy. And it's bad, but it's clearly worse for Shackleton. He's coughing up blood. He was weak. At one point, Captain Scott said, don't pull the sled, just ski alongside the rest of us, which meant the other two men had to do the work of three. And there was a day where he did sit on a sled, which had a sail on it, they're sailors. And he did sit on the thing for a day. And still with all that, one night, Wilson signaled to Scott he wanted to talk to him. And he said, Captain Scott, I think Shackleton's going to die tonight. But he didn't. With sheer force of will, he lived on. He got back. They got to the ship. All three men terribly played out. And Wilson was the worst of them. But when a relief ship came down to bring new supplies and take anybody home that needed to go home, Scott invalided Shackleton home because he was not capable of doing polar work. He didn't have the constitution for it. And so his first trip to Antarctica, Shackleton was sent home. And you said you could have this in your mind's eye, standing at the railing, looking at the Antarctic going away and back north. Well, he came back, and we know that from his close friend and very honest fellow that in being invalided home was a defining moment of Shackleton's life. He was determined to go back to Antarctica, not only just to be there, but to lead men in Antarctica. When these guys get back, all of these guys who want to go, you find that they're looking for something. They're looking for a friendly millionaire. Somebody will put up the cash for an expedition and in return you get a mountain named for you. And in 1907, he found one. And he bought a ship, the Nimrod, and he sailed down. He sailed down to the Antarctic. And on this ship, they were doing some science. Shackleton was not exactly enthusiastic about science as compared especially to someone like Scott or Amundsen. But to making the pole, he said, I will get to the pole. So they landed and they did other things, and then it was time to go to try to get to the pole. Well, you realize right off the bat what a long shot it is, because on the first day, one of their means of transporting stuff failed. And they had to make the decision that although they were on just barely starvation rations, we'd have to cut it more so we'd have more money, more food to go further and more days. So they set off. And Shackleton had been talking on the Scott expedition with guys who had experience in the Arctic, and they said, hey, ponies work great. And they apparently did. So he had relied on ponies for his transport primarily. He had a ballyhoo thing with dogs and with a car, but it's mostly ponies. So they're got the ponies, and ponies at certain points, they will be put down and they will be a depot of food for the way back. And they keep going and they're on the Great Ice Barrier, is what they called it in that period. We know it as the Ross Ice Shelf today. It's a piece of ice, basically 600 miles by 200 miles. It's bigger than France. And as they were going on, they were hoping that the pole would be on this ice barrier. But one day, up looming in the distance was the Transantarctic Mountains. We got there. They had no time to survey for 3 or 4 weeks. But Shackleton, with his own luck, found a glacier that was really perfect, he thought, and they started up this Beardmore Glacier. And then, they're cutting their rations. By this time, when they take their temperature, there's a doctor with them, and he took their temperature. They didn't range, they weren't warm enough to range on the scale of the thermometer. They're living on very little food and increasingly suffering from things like dysentery because of all meat diet from the dead ponies. And they're still going 1 foot ahead again, one ahead. And the last pony, Frank Wild on it, was behind him. The 3 men went across, and then there was a horrible screech. And they turned around, and Frank Wild was there, but the pony was gone. He had fallen into a crevasse. You can read all about this if you want to. It's the number that's this pounds per square foot on the ice. It affects the pony was going to fall where the human or a dog wouldn't have. Well, now you can look at it this way 2 ways. Most people, I think, look at it and say, well, that loss was 3 weeks of food, and that's going to be a factor in whether he makes it to the pole. And they push on across, and they get finally to the polar plateau. Now they know where it is. The pole is on this plateau. And every day he has to do his accounts. Can we get there and get back? And it's very clear that they're not going to make it to and from the pole. That pony, by the way, which I've always thought was a bad idea, it was a terrible disaster. But one of my colleagues, the brilliant scholar, argues that that was not an interruption of Shackleton's good luck. It was an example of it, because otherwise he might have tried further to go to the pole, and we would have never heard about him because he would never have been found. So anyhow, they go, and here's his thinking. It's pretty clear. He's been sent home as an invalid, can't do it. He's failed the first time. If he fails the second time, he's going to be, go down in polar history as, that Shackleton guy, he always failed, the footnote in polar history. And this weighed on him as it would weigh on anyone who has ambition. But as they pulled further and further towards the south, he came to the realization he had a higher duty, and that was to bring his men home safe and sound. And if it meant that he would be the butt of Shackleton jokes, the way people from Ohio tell jokes about people from Michigan, that would be what he would have to face. And so he turned north. They barely made it. They had one situation where after breakfast they had no food, and they had to go almost 40 miles to get to the next depot, as exhausted as they were. I'm telling to you, this is the closest of close calls. And they get back, and they're safe and alive, and the ship catches them, and they go home. And he has done what he set out to, not what he set out to do, but what his, I would say, mores as a leader, that no matter how bad he will look for this, and he expects to be, Shackleton the failure, he has a hard duty to his men who signed up with him and expects that they will come home to their families. And so he comes back, hasn't reached the pole, and he expects that's his legacy. It will be Shackleton the loser. But ironically, when he gets back, the newspaper that sponsors him, the Daily Mail, it's one of the, not the high class ones, work class one, middle class and working class. He's their boy. They make all sorts of things. Here he is, Shackleton, the man who found the route to the pole. I mean, and of course, he's such a charming guy. God, I mean, he had an interview with a Kaiser one for 15 minutes. It was like 2 hours long. I mean, just everybody wanted to see him. And he had to tell the story night after night for months to pay off the deals or the debts of the expedition. Although behind the scenes, the women involved with the men who were in this expedition eventually got Parliament to give him a grant to pay off his debts. So I would say this, given that he was younger, that it was his first command, that he had no proven success to buffer this, but this comes down like a second failure, that this turning back and saving the lives of his men is Shackleton's finest hour. 1907, 1909. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, TH. We have a bunch of questions that we're going to start reading to you. So,
I know,
TH.
I know the capital of Ohio, so let's go with those questions.
So the first question is, some people might call Shackleton's voyages pointless and reckless vanity projects. Were they justifiable from a scientific point of view, or was Shackleton just a man in search of an expedition?
That's a tough question because, Shackleton's everybody's hero. So I've had people who come up to me after a lecture somewhere and say, not on a ship. The people on the ships are adventuresome people. But, I gave this talk sometime to, one time, a group of academics. And a woman came up and said, what is he doing? Well, the answer is, in the total, Antarctica and these expeditions, even in a period, we're only talking about 2 here. There's, a whole bunch of them. And most of them, especially the non-Shackleton ones, are huge successes in science. I mean, the guys go down, they go for 2 years, they come back with 15 volumes, folio volumes of science. This is a huge opening of Antarctica. And today, as well as 1900, the questions that we are asking about the globe, about climate, about weather, the answers are in Antarctica, which is why not only do you feel special just seeing it and being acting it, but you have in the back of your mind, you're helping preserve this place for future generations. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. That was a great answer. The second question is, what was the draw to Antarctica? Why did Shackleton want to return multiple times?
So what's the draw for him going back?
Yes, what was the draw to Antarctica? Why did Shackleton want to return?
Let's see, one sign. He only went 4 times. So he for him, it was the adventure. We have to, he wasn't interested in science. He didn't have the attitude of Amundsen, who realized if the expedition science is good, your expedition is more important. And it's, I don't think he had good scientists, in fact, great scientists with him, but personally, he wasn't like Scott, who had a little laboratory or anything like that. He's more like the difference between the slogans of the New York Times and the Rolling Stone. New York Times slogan is all the news that's fit to print. And Rolling Stones is all the news that fits. And I think that gives you a sort of sense where he fits in on the hierarchy of supporting science, but his men did great science.
That's good. Another question we have is, why didn't Shackleton's men on the Nimrod and Endurance develop scurvy?
Oh, yeah, I should have said that. It's not a comment. You get scurvy if you don't have fresh food that gives you vitamin C and that sort of thing and keeps you going. It's astounding to many college professors that freshmen living in their dorms don't get scurvy because they haven't seen a vegetable the entire semester. But in reality, it's a deficiency, and we know how to handle it. And they also, there were two schools in 1901. One was wrong and one was right. The right one is it's vitamin deficiency, and you can get it from undercooked. You can cure yourself by having undercooked meat. Or if you're really good, as these guys were doing on the Nimrod expedition, for lunch, they would have frozen pony meat to suck on for lunch while they kept pulling the sled. And that gave them some relief. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. We have time for a couple of more questions. So the next question is, given all you know about Shackleton, what is one of the most exciting things you've seen in Antarctica?
Oh, um, I've been in the Antarctic parts of 22 seasons, Antarctic seasons, and I can. There are things that you don't very often see any kind of an emperor in the penguin in the peninsula, but I've seen several, and they do have popping up. They're usually juveniles. I'm trying to think what I would say that the most. I can tell you the one. Why do you go back? People think they're going to go to Antarctica to see penguins. Yeah, we can guarantee you're going to see a penguin. But what brings them back for a second and third cruise with us? It's the ice. It's the ice. It's the ice that caught Fridtjof Nansen when he was a 20-year-old and he went to the Arctic. It's the ice. It's so, he said, so perfect as perfect as infinity. And it is wonderful. You just can't, you stand out there on the decks and watch the ice go. It's just, it is magical. Even if you never saw a penguin, I think it'd be worth going. That's how strong it is. Okay.
Antarctica is beautiful. I do agree with you. So we have time for one more question. The last question is, how important were the men he chose to go with him to his success?
Oh, there's a sense. I'll give you the shortest answer. These guys, as a group, they are tough as nails, and they, for the most part, with of course, there's always an outlier in any group, but they are sensible and follow his leadership. But what makes this question so good is that how, even on, let's go back to the Endurance, how is it he does all this to get the ships and makes the 4 trips and all things, but the 2 people who made that possible was Frank Worsley, who navigated in a rare, ethereal way. He found an island after 800 miles with only a half a dozen sightings. I mean, nobody can do that except him. And so if he didn't have him, he'd have probably died at sea. And the other one is Frank Wild, who had more experience in the Antarctic in the period than Shackleton. And Frank Wild was just a natural leader. He'd get up the ball, he kept their optimism up. He made them believe that Shackleton would come and get him. He's just a phenomenal figure. And without Frank Wild, this story might have been completely different. And I'll say one last thing. Many of us are so happy that when we go to see South Georgia, and we try always to get to the grave of Shackleton, for the last few years, they have brought Frank Wilde's remains and deposit them in the cemetery next to his friend Shackleton. It's a moving moment to stand there and see that they're in some way together for eternity.
Thank you again, TH, for the inspiring lecture. And on behalf of Abercrombie & Kent, we thank all of you for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.